Hey there, Jerry Audet, managing editor of Surfcasters Journal and co-host of the Surfcast podcast. I am here today at the Saltwater Edge tackle shop in Rhode Island to talk to you about Super Strike plugs. I obviously, by that byline, am a surfcaster, and that's pretty much what I'm known for, though I do a couple of other kinds of fishing. And I think that the Super Strike series of plugs are absolutely essential for every surfcaster. And I don't mean one of them or two of them, I mean all of them. And I think, so I feel so strongly about that I think if you had just the Super Strikes, you'd probably be in pretty good shape. There are other things that I use that I believe are as essential, but if you're on a budget and you want to get started, Super Strike's a great place to start. It really is. They're premium plugs, and they work every single time, every single one out of the package. Now, that being said, there are so many rules about these plugs on the internet, on social, on forums in particular, at seminars, at fishing shows. You'll hear that, the Super Strike darter is really only for current. The popper is really only for popping. The heavy needlefish is really only good for when it's rough or when it's windy. These things are not necessarily true. And I really encourage you with the entire line of plugs to consider what you need it to do, what you want it to do, and then figure out how to make it do that. Because a lot of them are a lot more versatile than they get credit for. The darter specifically, I think the darter gets a bad rap for a sort of a niche plug, and people don't want to use it unless they have a big rip in front of them or an inlet. And frankly, I use them virtually everywhere. They almost never leave my bag. So actually, that's a great place to get started. So I have my bag here. I have my personal plugs here, with one exception we'll get to. And I'm going to go through each one in the series and just trying to give you some of my thoughts about them. So we'll start with the darter since I started talking about that. Oh, one more thing before I keep going. Every single one of my plugs you'll see has no rear hook on it. The Super Strikes work really well with nothing on the back. And we know, coming out of the state of Massachusetts, the data is showing us that release mortality is dramatically lower if you don't have a rear hook on there. Saltwater Edge is really pushing this. I have believed this for a decade now, and all of my plugs, have no hook on the rear. So as I start pulling stuff out, you're going to see there's stuff like chain on the back or flags. Depending on what you want the plug to do, it's really up to you to rig it. But for the most part, using a flag on the back is probably sufficient. The darter can be a little finicky, but the more I talk to people about this, the more I realize people are using it without anything on the back, a simple flag, a more complex flag, all kinds of different weightings, just cutting the tines, cutting the edges right off the hook, etc. So just want to say that because you're going to notice it. So let's talk about the Super Strike darter first. This plug, again, gets a bad rap. It's allegedly only for strong current. That's completely incorrect. I use the darter everywhere. I use the darter on flats. I use them on sand beach, rocky shoreline, sandy shoreline, estuaries. I use it when it's rough. I use it when it's calm, generally more calm than rough. But they really work anywhere there's moving water. And moving water can be made by a bunch of different things. It can be tidal current, it can be an exchange from, like an outflow or a breachway, or it can be wind. And sweep along a beach is also another great example of where these things really excel. And if I had to sort of sum up one big tip about the Super Strike, besides the fact that you should just be using it no matter where you're fishing and what you're doing, particularly at night, but not only just at night, would be to use it on sand. These things do not get used enough on the sand beaches, big bad sand beaches, South Shore, Long Island, a lot of places on Cape Cod. There's plenty of places in Maine, and of course in New Jersey, and then point south, maybe not even just for stripers. These things work really, really well in waves. You don't even necessarily have to have a ton of lateral movement. So, pulling it through a wave, it might kind of be doing nothing, which may not be a bad thing, by the way, but it may not be doing very much, but when it hits a wave, it'll do a little shimmy. It'll do a little shimmy, and it might come up and come down a little bit. And all of that is really natural. Looks like a whole bunch of different kinds of bait, from bait fish to squid and all kinds of other things. And it's a very striper-sized bait in terms of it's big enough to attract any large fish, but it's not unmanageable to cast. So that's the first plug, and that's probably my favorite of the whole Super Strike series. It is. The next one is the Needlefish, or the Super N fish. I only brought the slow sinking models today. I'm going to start there first. The most important one for me is the largest size. So it's almost 7 inches, basically. And these ones I use more than anyone else in my bag. And I fish some of them completely hookless on the back, like this. And some of them I fish with very simple flags. But I actually prefer them without a flag. I think they don't really need it. Now, my partner in crime at the podcast, Toby, he believes very strongly they have to have something on the back because it helps them pivot around the center point and helps them swim a little better. But for my uses, I actually don't think it makes too much of a difference. Now, everybody looks at this and thinks, sand eel, sand eel, sand eel, sand eel. That's not the only thing these things replicate. And again, unlike the darter, where I'm like, oh, you should be using it on a sand beach more, these can be used everywhere. They don't just belong on the sand beach where there's sand eels. And if I had to sum up one thing that I would like to point out about these plugs, particularly these ones, the slow sink, it's that you can swing them. You can swing them like a bucktail. And what you can do with a bucktail, you can do with these needlefish. And the fast sinker in particular can be useful in very strong current and deeper water. So that's the red eye. And I believe that's 3 ounces for the big one. The medium size, the middle size one, I don't use quite as much. It's really, for me, it's sort of redundant. It potentially does cast a little bit better, even though it's a little bit smaller. But for me, if I had to just choose one, I'd choose the biggest one. I do use the fast sinker in burly conditions on sand beaches. Big waves, wind in my face, you can really punch it. Or you can swing it deep, but that's really where I use mine more. The fast sinker is in burly conditions. Then there's the little guy. This is the little guy. The little guy for me is a back bay estuary plug. I think it replicates smaller baits there, and I tend to fish it very actively, lots of tip action. I don't just reel it back straight. For the needlefish in general, I don't generally just reel it back really slow, as you'll read a lot. Oh, just reel slow and then reel even slower. I don't necessarily stick to that rule at all. Give it some action for all of those. But the small one in particular, I like to fish very actively, usually pretty close to the surface. And really the sinkers are the ones that I use the most. There's other applications for the floaters, but I don't really care for those. The next one is the bullet. That's probably the closest for the next plug. This one is not mine because I forgot mine today, which is why it has a rear hook on it, which is why it's taking me so long to get it out of here because it's all hung up in the other plugs. So the bullet is an interesting plug. This is one I don't use quite as much, but it can be very effective in the same manner I was talking about with the needlefish, the Super N fish, in that you can swing this like a bucktail. So if you're like, the bucktail's the greatest lure ever, I use the bucktail all the time. I should use the bucktail more. I don't fish them enough. They're boring, I don't want to use them. Any of those things, include a bullet in your bag, because the bullet can be used in the very same way, swinging it low and slow, up higher, swimming it over the tops of stuff straight. That tends to be how I use it. This, for me, unlike the other plugs, this is more of a fall plug for me. That doesn't mean it is for you, and you shouldn't stick to that. But for me, I find that this comes out of the bag a lot more in the fall because there are some smaller baits around. And again, I don't get too hung up on the size visually, but there's something about the action and the vibration that this puts out which is more akin to smaller baits. The next one for the night plugs and for the surf guy is the bottle plug. Now, the bottle plug has very strict rules. You only take this out when it's rough water. You dig it in and you go slow and you thump it along. It can do a lot more than that. And actually, this plug I feel has fallen out of favor in like the last, 10, 15 years, maybe even more than that. The bottle plug used to be a very, very important plug back in the day, old school. And it's not as popular now, and I'm not really sure why, but back in the day, it was used very similar to a swimmer, where you casted it out and you reeled it back. And yes, they dig in, and yes, they can go a little bit deep, but they're not a deep swimming plug like a deep metal lip or something like that. So I think that this is a very aggressive plug that offers something completely different from anything else that I've shown you, and really Very different from pretty much any other plug. Some metal lips are pretty aggressive, but this guy has a very, very aggressive swim that puts out a lot of vibration. They have rattles in them. This is very controversial amongst people who love bottles. A lot of people drill them and dump them out, but that's up to you. I have some with and some without, but I wanted to bring one that was stock. This is definitely a plug that you do not need anything on the back of. I fish them with a giant hook in the front. That's a 4.0 BKK, I believe. So the next and final plug, I believe, is the Little Neck Swimmer. This is a legendary plug, which again has a lot of rules, and I can't believe how many times I've been out in the day, which is not the most because I'm not out in the day very much, and see you guys casting it out, holding the rod pretty much straight and giving it the little tap, 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 tap retrieve. And it's going plunk, 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 plunk along the surface. And they cast over and over and over and over and over doing the same thing. That can be effective. It's definitely one way to fish it, but it's not the only way. And in fact, if you're using the Little Neck Popper like a popper, I actually like a slow retrieve on the black eyes, on the normal sinkers. A slower retrieve where you're barely keeping it on the surface, maybe you're not even keeping it on the surface. And then you catch up to it and you give it one hard bonk and it goes plunk. And I think that for me, that's been much more effective. I really like that with the bigger one. The bigger one doesn't seem to be nearly as popular, but I actually end up throwing this more. I think because when I want a popper, I want to make a lot of disruption because otherwise I'm using something else like a walk the dog lure or something like that. So even though this is potentially one of our most popular plugs, I actually end up using the big one more. And I know my friend and editor of the Fisherman, longtime editor of Surfcasters Journal, Dave Anderson, I know he also likes the bigger 3-ounce one as well for all the same reasons. It's stable in bigger water, so you can fish it when there's waves and stuff. But the thing that the big one does not do as well as the small one is swimming it. So you look at this and you think popper because it says popper in the name, but these plugs can actually be swum like a plug. So it's a little bit of a learned skill about the speed of the retrieve that you need, but you can swim these and they swim, back and forth and wiggle back and forth and rotate around this hook. This can be effective day and night, but honestly, it's more of a nighttime thing for me. I haven't done so well just swimming them during the day, so not quite as effective. You're going to want the black eye for that. You're going to want the slow sinker. The heavy one for me is almost an emergency plug. I have them. I bring them out occasionally, mostly in the fall, but they're really just, I want to get something out there. I want to get that profile out there into the water. The retrieve doesn't matter so much. I just got to keep it off the bottom, and I just got to get it out into the water because the fish are feeding. And I just got to get them something that looks like a bait fish, something like that. So that's generally how I fish the red eye. But there's other ways too. Again, you can swing them because they sink. So you can swing them like you might do a bucktail, which I know anglers do and not something that a lot of people do. I haven't mentioned two of the options for this plug, and that is the small one, or, and I didn't even bring any of these, the green eye, which is the floater. The small one for me, again, is a back bay plug. I would say out of all of the Super Strike plugs in my bag, besides the red eye, which I only have the middle size, this is my least used plug. I even use the bullet more than this. This, for me, again, is a back bay plug, an estuary plug, an early season. I tend to bring this out in the early season more. I like to fish this when it's really calm. The calmer, the better. Like glass, these can be really effective. And honestly, that's where a floater can come in too, of all sizes. The floater, you can work across the surface, just sort of swimming it, not doing anything, and just giving a little ploop, and swimming a little further and give it a little ploop. And when it's really calm like that, the fish are following it, they're following, you give it that little bit of a bump, and boom, they'll take it. Let again, I'd honestly, frankly, rather have a black eye. I think that they're more versatile. You can do more with them. You can let them sink more. You can cast them further. They're just more versatile. So I'd rather have the sinking plug. And with these, not always around the small bait. So a lot of anglers will take these out when they're like seen spearing or shrimp or something like that. But you know, it's really big for that kind of stuff, and it's more on the order of like the chocolate bar peanuts is more of what I think of when I think of something like this. But squid can work around squid as well because it's kind of squiddy sized. Even though I know it looks a little small, it definitely works for that. So that is just some very basics of the Super Strike and how to use them. I really encourage you to check them out. If you're using the Needlefish and you haven't chosen the darter, make the darter your 2025 season goal. Same thing with any of these plugs. Add one of them. Add one of them a month until you have all of them. And I think you'll find that they really will fill up your bag and fill a lot of voids that maybe you didn't even know you had.